everybody. Well, the textbook publisher finally sent me a bunch of the images from the book, which they'd only sent me text before, so I was digging up pictures from other classes and stuff to use. So now I've been like a mad scramble to try to get the images into these PowerPoints so I could actually start using them. So better late than never, I guess. Let's see. Today we're going to finish up chapter 1 and probably get an amount into chapter 2. Anyone have any general questions about anything before we just jump into it? Yeah.
Is the textbook online or do we have to buy it?
I believe there's an online version that you can buy.
Okay.
But there should also be a paper version in the bookstore, I believe. Yeah.
Are all the notes we're going to cover in class like parts of the textbook?
Can you say it again?
Like are all the notes for like chapter 1, is that in the textbook that you like published?
So I published the PowerPoint that has basically notes. It has a very abbreviated version of the chapter. Students can use those as study notes, but you'll need more information than that. Than the notes. You do need to get a version of the book. And if you want, later on, if people want to take a picture of the cover to make sure they're getting the right one, because there's lots of human geography books out there. There's lots of different ones. So, but this is the first edition, and this is the one that is, the published date says 2024. And I know that it's 2023, but that's how book publishing works. They say 2024, even though most of the info in here is probably from 2022 at the most recent. Any other questions? All right. See, I think this is the area we left off. Globalization being one of the topics and themes that we'll cover a lot throughout the textbook, really. Globalization is something that, of course, has been happening for a long time, but it's intensified lately, especially with satellite communication, and then with the internet, with technological changes through time. Globalization just kind of happens more and more quickly. Although things do reverse course sometimes. When ancient Rome fell, their trade networks all kind of dissolved and their globalization process came to a halt. During the pandemic, obviously, a lot of aspects of globalization stopped and reversed course quite a bit. China right now is dealing with the fallout of, used to be very interconnected globally. A lot of places, got their manufactured goods from China. But during the pandemic, a lot of countries sought other places to get their inputs for different things that they were producing. And those countries now have those established. And so now China kind of wants to come back and be part of those trade networks, but people have kind of already moved on a bit. World systems theory. This chapter only talks a little bit about this and other theories about globalization, and it's really later on we have chapters on economics and on development and things like that, so we'll come back to these things a bit later if it seems like it's very, very short in here. But in a nutshell, world systems theory, that looks at how the world is interconnected basically in trading relationships. It suggests that there's basically 3 different tiers. You have a core, you have a periphery, and you have a semi-periphery. What does that mean? Well, core tends to be the more developed countries that are make a lot, but they also consume a lot. Those core economies need raw materials to keep on producing as much as they do and to keep on consuming as much as they do. And they prefer to get those from what are called periphery countries. Periphery meaning, usually their main exports are not manufactured goods, but more the raw materials that are made into manufactured goods. A lot of countries don't want to be in the peripheral relationship. They would like to move up from that. So for example, many, many years ago, Minnesota was considered a bit of a periphery. We were supplying things like lumber and, iron ore that was mined to other states and other countries. And, the state itself wanted to develop, not just be producing those things, because those goods tend to be very low paid. The wages that people get in those industries, as well as how much those products sell. In a nutshell, the more basically human work that goes into a product, usually the more value it has, right? So a piece of steel versus like this contraption, well, this has a lot of human effort, right? It's like they're probably a whole team of people who are just working on this one little sensor, right? If you think about all the work that has gone into a product like this versus a piece of lumber, right? And so something like this can get a fair amount of money compared to those raw resources that just don't get as much. Semi-periphery, that's the countries, let me go back to the map, many countries around the world that want to move into being a core country. And I would say arguments could be made that the greenish countries have moved into that level. It kind of depends on how you measure it, and also depends the time frame you're kind of talking about. Like I said, China itself is actually having lots of economic problems. You might have saw on the news, our president is in India. India very much kind of wants to take China's place, yeah.
So what's the other category on this map?
Well, that's a good question. I don't remember, but looking at those countries, I would say, well, you don't really actually have a lot of people living here. You do have people living there. You know what? I don't remember what the other category on this map was. Well, I could look it up, but I'm just gonna move on. My guess is those are countries that there's not enough data for us to categorize where they are. That's usually what other categories mean. It means we don't have enough data, we're not quite sure. And so rather than just make a guess, we're just gonna say other. I would say in general, the places that are yellow are a bit less developed, but I think that those countries also don't have giant trade networks as well, so they might just not categorically fit. Where was I? Oh yes, so India very much wants to take China's place in global trade networks, and well, our next chapters are going to be on population and whatnot, so I'll get into this more in depth. But China is having a bit of a population problem there. Younger generation is quite a bit smaller than the older generation, and so there's worry about a lot of money being spent on taking care of the older populations. India doesn't quite have that problem. It may have that problem in 20 years or so, but they have a very large younger generation right now. Like I said, I was throwing these visuals in because I just got them from the publisher. There's a section in this chapter about conservation and sustainability, mostly because that's going to be also a focus a bit, and each chapter is going to have aspects of this as part of their overall focus. This little section, if you remember from the reading, was focused on creating a number of different preserves around the world. And so, even though you have plenty of places where there's a lot of fishing and lots of other things going on, mining, deep sea often, there are areas that a number of countries want to move forward with making large preserves that would not be affected by these types of things. Some other concepts from this chapter, we've already talked about these terms a little bit: site, situation, density, pattern, distribution. What does all this mean? Well, the example here from the book, you have a section of London here on the right and a section of Boston on the left. And as you look at how these are developed, how cities developed through time, Well, the site and situation, the context is something that's important to know, which is, of course, London is a much older city. Older cities, their development patterns, what we would call organic development. Organic development meant that basically people put up buildings and houses and structures, and they didn't really organize where roads were. That wasn't, roads just kind of became the spaces that were in between the buildings, and that was kind of it. That's what we call organic planning. Because when much of the older cities of the world came about, they were what's called the walking city, meaning that people walked everywhere. So if you can imagine if you had to walk to where you work, to where you go to sleep at night, to where you shop, if that happened, well, things would be a lot denser, right? Other cities that developed much later, Boston, right, many years later, well, that development was more planned, right? That's when you tend to have a grid pattern. If you have the time and effort and the money to plan a bit more advanced, that's why some of the reasons these have different patterns, right? I would also say, in general, the more recent an urban development is, the more kind of sprawly it often is, because through time, transportation technologies have increased. Obviously we have the car now, but before that there was rail lines everywhere. Trains used to be more of a thing. Development was more focused along those. Well, in our later chapters on development, we'll talk about development within North America, why some cities are more sprawly than others. Often it's the date that they got their population growth. If it was earlier, it's more dense. If it was later, it's more sprawl. We also talked about time and space compression a bit more, and about how travel has the speed has increased through time, and it's continuing to increase a bit, especially when it comes to communications. This is a little image in the map, in our book, kind of showing just how the world is kind of becoming a smaller world, as they say. Time distance decay, a couple visuals from the book. This is basically looking at, well, the right is a good example of how far people are willing to travel for certain types of shopping, right? And so, for example, a convenience store, like maybe the stuff that you would buy in a gas station, people are not really willing to drive a large amount of space to go to that type of a store. And so they tend to be small and tend to be spread out, right? Now, if you have a larger store, department store, superstore, people, well, as you can see there, they're more willing to drive further. And it still has absolute limits, but that means that you could have one of these big stores and you could have more space in between them, right? Or if you have, let's say you have a superstore somewhere and you want to locate another one, you might not want to locate it next to a different superstore. That'd be a bit competition, although sometimes that does obviously happen. Site and situation and sustainability. This is a little section that's toward the end of this chapter, looking at New Orleans, right? And a lot of the factors about the development of New Orleans, especially the earlier development of New Orleans being a bit of a, for the US, it's an older city. But when it was originally put in and whatnot, they didn't really think about long-term sustainability, right? It wasn't really a thing that came up. And so things like being very low elevation or large sections being actually under sea level makes it very risky for flooding, right? For hurricane damage, things like this. The map on the left just shows basically the watershed. The watershed being all of the rain and precipitation that happens in that green area all eventually comes down to the Mississippi and here to this delta. A delta is, as rivers move, they have kinetic energy and they pick up stuff, you know. You could usually see how much stuff is in the river just by looking at it and how kind of cloudy or not cloudy the water is. Well, it picks up that stuff and then it basically dumps it off at the end, and that's what a delta is. A delta is kind of always building because it's carrying all this and kind of dropping it off as it hits the ocean. What this means is usually a delta tends to be very fertile land, and so it's places that people want to live because it's very productive when it comes to agriculture. But again, like I said, it's not a place where they were thinking long term of, well, what's going to happen if there's more hurricanes and more flooding. Yeah. And we did this, so this is where we came in. So I'm going to switch to the next chapter. Alright, actually, I'm going to stop and start this. I'm going to try to record these classes, so if people miss, they could